God often calls us to go, and that's a normal part of the Christian life. So there are lots of occasions where God calls people to go in the Old Testament, New Testament. And so I think there's always a willingness and an openness to go. And those things might feel like big moves, which obviously happen quite rarely in our lives. But then the smaller going, like just going to talk to someone who we feel God's prompting us to go and talk to, or there's a sense in which we feel like we should go to a different group of people or a new activity or something like that. But then normally I think we're just sort of embedded where we are. And I often feel like it's like swimming in the sea. And which I don't do very regularly, but when you're swimming in the sea, most of the time you just put your head down and you're just swimming. But every now and again you pop your head up and you're just checking that you're going in the right direction and you get your bearings. And I feel there's something like that in calling. A lot of the time we're just getting on with life and just trying to love people around us and be kind and be good and be faithful and all the rest. But every now and again we sort of pop our head up and think, oh, am I going in the right direction? And it's probably not the most effective thing if you're spending your whole time thinking, am I doing the right thing? Should I be moving? If you spend your whole time, that's taking up quite a lot of your headspace. And so I think you probably want to assume for the most part that you're where God wants you to be, unless God calls you elsewhere. But every now and again there are these moments where you pop your head up and think, oh Lord, what's the right thing? And focus is actually quite a good time for that. You're just saying, oh Lord, am I going in the right direction? Is there something else you want me to do? So I think there's that balance of being open always to whether God wants to change of direction, but also getting stuck in whatever location you find yourself in. And that is always tough. Yeah, there's always a temptation to leave and actually, or to run away. So Jonah, he runs, and that's not because he doesn't want to be where he is. It probably is because he would prefer to be where he is. So with Abraham, he goes and there's a famine in the land. He thinks, well, let's go off to Egypt. It might be better there. Whereas it seems like God has called them to Canaan. I think in those times where it's tempting to run away, I suppose you look again at what God said to you in the past. You check, Lord, is this really what you've asked us to do? And then I suppose you hold on to those promises. And so for us personally, it's holding on to those promises from Genesis 12, where God calls Abraham to go and he says, I will bless you. And so you hold on, and you start praying, oh Lord, you promised to bless us here. And this is difficult and it's tempting to run away, but Lord, you've called us here and you promised to bless us. So please bless us and protect us and provide for us and give us everything that we need. And I suppose you assume that unless God has said, now it's the next thing, that you're there for a reason. So I think there are normally three main driving points or motivations for someone's calling. There's what you want for yourself. There's your internal desires, dreams, ambitions, your experience. And all these things are good things, and God can work through these things. And that's where you start with the self, I suppose. And then there's starting with other people. Like, what do other people want you to do? What do other people need you to do? So you might have children, or you might have parents that need looking after, you might have relatives, or just the needs of the community. And so you can start with the self, you can start with others, and within each person there's a desire for authenticity, which is good, and there's a desire to make a difference and to serve other people, and that's good as well. But each of those are imperfect because we don't know ourselves perfectly. And within ourselves, there's also selfishness and pride and self-deceit and all those kinds of things. And even with trying to help other people, it's very easy to try and help other people but actually make things worse. Or we try and help and actually someone else should be helping them. Or our own ego gets involved and we like being needed and like being wanted. And so that's complicated as well. But the third motivation is that God has called us, and that it's the voice of God. And so instead of starting with the self or with others, you start with God himself. And there are moments where all of these three are aligned. You think, God wants me to do this, I'm passionate about this, and I can see it would make a real difference. But it doesn't always align like that. Sometimes there's something you think, oh, I'd really love to do this, but I just don't think God's asking me to do it. And there are other times where you think, God's asking me to do this, I don't really feel passionate about this. I'd rather do something else, but I know this is actually what God is wanting me to do. But as we learn to place ourselves in that circle of obedience to God, of putting God before even self or others, what we find is those three elements of motivation begin to align. And when we place ourselves fully in God's hands, His will for us, our own authenticity, the ability to serve others and make a difference, all of those things begin to align. But it does so when we put God at the top, rather than saying, this is what I want to do, please God help me. Or this I think would be helpful, God please help me. You start with God, and then the authenticity and then the ability to make a difference, all of those align together. Yeah, I mean, obedience is always tricky, because there's something deep within every human being that wants to be the master of their own destiny and to make their own decisions. And so there's always a struggle. But it seems to be that God, as He calls us and directs our lives, He takes us through stages and He leads us on a journey. So with Abraham, first of all, He says, leave your country, and he does that. And then He says, trust me for a son, when it seemed impossible. And then He said, be willing to sacrifice your son that's been given to you miraculously. And so He doesn't jump to the most difficult one. He takes us through a journey. And it's normally the small obediences that lead to the big obediences. And so even with something like the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, first of all, He said, go to the mountain. So they start with a small obedience. Okay, we can go to the mountain. And then the bigger obedience of going to try and make disciples of all nations flows from that. So I think it's be obedient in the small things. And in being obedient in the small things, we learn to be obedient in the big things. I mean, every calling is opposed. Whenever we respond in obedience to God, there's always some kind of reaction. And so Abraham goes to the new land and there's a famine there. Moses tries to liberate the Israelites and things get worse for the Israelite slaves before they get better. In every example, it seems that whenever we try and obey God, there's always some kind of opposition. And sometimes it will come from the state, in some places where people are persecuted. And sometimes it will come just from the culture, and we just feel embarrassed or humiliated or out of sync with what people think and feel and believe. Sometimes the opposition is coming from within, because we just don't want to do this. And I think as long as we expect it, it's not unusual. Something hasn't gone wrong. And often, instead of it being a sign that something's gone wrong, actually it's a sign that something's right. And so we expect it, and then God promises to work through it. It doesn't mean that every battle will be won in the way that we want. It doesn't mean we won't have scars. But I think if we expect the battles, expect opposition, and then I suppose trust God that He will be faithful through it all, even if we're not completely faithful, even if we mess up or make mistakes along the way, that He'll be faithful through that whole process.